Tonight, we are not uncovering a scandal or exposing a conspiracy, and we are certainly not shouting about villains or heroes, because this is boring history, and boring history moves slowly. Tonight, we are talking about vegetables, medieval vegetables that once grew quietly in fields and gardens across Europe and early settlements, and were eaten regularly without much thought. Vegetables that were never officially banned by modern agriculture, but were slowly made irrelevant through efficiency, standardization, and the desire for predictable profit. And when people say big agriculture banned these 15 medieval vegetables, what they usually mean is that these plants did not fit neatly into modern systems of farming, shipping, storage, and marketing, so they were politely ignored until most people forgot they existed. One of these was skirret, a sweet root vegetable that required time to prepare and patience to enjoy. It needed boiling and peeling, and sometimes boiling again, which was perfectly acceptable in medieval kitchens where time moved slowly, but far less appealing in modern food systems that prefer speed and simplicity. So skirret faded from fields and menus without complaint. Another was a leafy plant called Good King Henry, which sounds important, but was really just a humble green that grew easily near homes and along paths. It was productive but inconsistent and did not behave uniformly enough for large-scale farming or mechanized harvesting. And inconsistency is something modern agriculture avoids, so Good King Henry quietly stepped aside. Alexander's was once common before celery took its place. It had a stronger aroma and softer texture, but it varied too much from plant to plant, and modern agriculture prefers every stalk to look the same, so celery was refined and standardized, while Alexander's slowly disappeared. Sea kale grew along coastlines and had a mild, salty flavor, but it was fragile and did not tolerate long journeys in refrigerated trucks, and vegetables that dislike transportation rarely survive global supply chains. Rampion became popular at one point and was over-harvested from the wild before anyone thought seriously about cultivating it at scale, so it did not vanish through policy but through enthusiasm. Perpetual spinach kept growing and refused to stop on schedule, which caused difficulties for harvest planning and inventory management. Medieval chard once existed in many forms and colors, but modern farming selected only a few varieties that fit machines and markets, and the rest were simply not replanted. Saucify required a long growing period and careful handling, and while it tasted pleasant, it demanded more time than efficiency-based systems were willing to give. Parsley root looked like a carrot but tasted like parsley, and this confused shoppers who expected familiar flavors. Confusion leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to unsold produce, so parsley root was removed from mainstream production. Landcress grew freely and did not respond well to control or uniform planting. Garden orache once filled the role that spinach now dominated, but spinach grew faster and yielded more per acre, so orache slowly lost its place. Scorzonera had a dark exterior and pale interior, which made it visually unfamiliar and difficult to market to shoppers who prefer vegetables they recognize instantly. Hedge mustard thrived in poor conditions and was labeled a weed rather than a crop, which meant it received no investment. Patience dock lived up to its name by growing slowly and asking for time that modern agriculture was unwilling to give. Smallage, the wild ancestor of celery, remained stubbornly wild, while celery was bred to be larger and more predictable, and so smallage was left behind. None of these vegetables were dragged away or outlawed, and there were no announcements or bans posted on farm gates. They were replaced by crops that grew faster, shipped better, stored longer, and behaved consistently. Big agriculture did not hate these medieval vegetables and did not actively seek their destruction. It simply had no practical use for them. Some still exist today in seed banks, quiet gardens, and in the hands of very patient growers. They are not illegal or forbidden, they are merely inconvenient. And inconvenience, more than force, is often how history gently and quietly moves on. And if you are still awake listening to this, that is perfectly fine, because boring history has never been in a hurry. And as the years passed and farms grew larger and systems grew more complex, the idea of variety slowly became less important than the idea of reliability. Agriculture began to favor plants that could survive long storage in warehouses under artificial light and steady temperatures, plants that could be harvested all at once by machines rather than by hands moving slowly through soil. And many medieval vegetables simply did not adapt to this new expectation, not because they were weak or useless, but because they were designed for a different pace of life, a pace where meals were planned around seasons rather than shipping schedules, where flavor mattered more than appearance, and where a crooked root was not a problem. This shift did not happen overnight, and no one noticed it happening because it unfolded quietly over decades as seed catalogs narrowed and farmers were encouraged to grow what sold quickly and reliably. Vegetables that bruised easily or ripened unevenly or produced unpredictable yields were gently discouraged, sometimes through lower prices and sometimes through simple absence of demand. And so more plants faded from everyday use. Lovage, for example, once flavored soups and stews and was valued for its strong aroma, but it grew tall and unruly and did not fit well into compact modern farms, so it became a garden curiosity rather than a commercial crop. Spelt greens and heritage grains were replaced by varieties bred for uniform height and synchronized harvest. Edible flowers and bitter greens that medieval people tolerated without complaint were gradually replaced by milder flavors designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Bitterness required adjustment, and adjustment required effort, and effort does not scale easily. Even turnip varieties once came in dozens of regional forms, but only a few survived the transition to industrial farming because most were too small, too oddly shaped, or too slow. None of this was framed as loss at the time because there was always something new to replace what was disappearing. New hybrids promised higher yields and longer shelf life, and farmers understandably chose stability over nostalgia. And as supermarkets replaced local markets, the distance between the field and the table increased, and vegetables that could not survive that distance without losing quality were quietly removed from the journey. Medieval kitchens had accepted trimming, bruising, peeling, and waiting, but modern consumers preferred convenience and predictability. And so agriculture adapted not to history, but to habit. What remained were vegetables that behaved well under pressure, and what vanished were those that asked for patience. Today, when people say these vegetables were banned, what they often mean is that the system they belonged to no longer exists. The small fields, the mixed gardens, the local knowledge of when to harvest and how to prepare them slowly dissolved into larger operations with narrower choices. And yet, these vegetables are not truly gone. They wait in seed vaults and old gardening books and quiet backyards where people grow them not for profit, but for curiosity. They survive in footnotes and side notes and occasional mentions in medieval cookbooks that describe flavors without measurements and harvest times without dates. And this is perhaps the most boring ending possible. There is no villain and no final act, only a slow narrowing of choice driven by efficiency and convenience. And if you are still awake listening to this, that is perfectly fine, because boring history has never been in a hurry.
And as over time, the language around food itself began to change. Medieval people spoke of plants in terms of seasons and places and weather, while modern systems speak in terms of units and yield and efficiency. A vegetable was no longer something that adapted to its surroundings, but something that had to adapt to spreadsheets and logistics. And those that could not be easily counted, packaged, and predicted slowly slipped out of common use, even when they tasted fine and grew well in small spaces, because large agriculture is not designed to remember individual plants. It is designed to repeat successful outcomes at scale, and repetition favors sameness. This sameness gradually reshaped what people expected food to look like. Roots became straighter, leaves became brighter, and flavors became milder. Medieval vegetables often carried strong tastes and irregular forms that required explanation, and explanation slows down purchasing decisions. So they were replaced with vegetables that needed no explanation at all, ones that looked familiar even to someone who had never cooked them before. And as cooking habits changed, fewer people knew how to prepare vegetables that required soaking, trimming, or multiple stages of cooking. Knowledge that had once been passed quietly through households became unnecessary, and when knowledge disappears, demand usually follows. This is how foods vanish without ever being forbidden. They remain possible but impractical. Even seed saving, once common, became rare as farmers relied more on purchased seed optimized for specific conditions, which further narrowed variety. Medieval vegetables that thrived through diversity and adaptation were ill-suited to this model. They were not stable enough genetically to promise identical results year after year, and so they were considered risky. Risk is uncomfortable in systems built around certainty, and while none of these decisions were made with the intention of erasing history, the outcome was the same. A landscape that once supported many forms of the same plant slowly settled on just one or two versions deemed acceptable. And this narrowing happened quietly enough that most people never noticed. There were no protests or petitions because the changes were gradual, and each one seemed reasonable at the time. After all, choosing a vegetable that grows faster or stores longer appears sensible when viewed in isolation. But history is rarely shaped by single decisions. It is shaped by accumulation, and accumulated convenience slowly edits the past. Today, when someone encounters the name of an old vegetable, it often sounds fictional or exotic, even though it once fed entire communities. And this sense of unfamiliarity reinforces the idea that it does not belong in modern life. And yet, these plants are still capable of growing if given space and time. They do not resist the present, they simply do not rush to meet it. And in that refusal to hurry, they reveal something quietly uncomfortable about progress, that moving forward often means leaving behind things that worked perfectly well, not because they failed, but because they asked us to slow down. And slowing down has become one of the most difficult things for modern systems to do. And as this quiet narrowing continued, the memory of how these vegetables fit into daily life faded as well. Medieval meals were not designed for variety in the modern sense, but for reliability across seasons. People ate what grew nearby and what returned each year without needing permission from markets or suppliers. And when those plants disappeared from fields, the rhythms of meals changed too. Stews became simpler, flavors became more predictable, and the subtle differences between one village's food and another slowly blurred. This was convenient, and convenience rarely announces itself as loss. It simply arrives as normal. Cookbooks began to standardize measurements and ingredients, and anything that could not be found easily everywhere was slowly removed from recipes, not because it was bad, but because it was unavailable. And once something is unavailable, it becomes unnecessary. Once it becomes unnecessary, it becomes forgotten. And this forgetting does not feel dramatic in the moment, because there is always another vegetable to take its place, another substitute that works well enough, and well enough is usually sufficient. The medieval vegetables that lingered required attention and familiarity. They needed someone who knew when they were ready and how they behaved in different weather. But modern food systems favor instructions that are the same regardless of place. Plant according to schedule, harvest according to date, ship according to contract. Anything that disrupted this rhythm was labeled inefficient and quietly set aside. And even language followed this pattern, as the names of old plants stopped being spoken, and without being spoken, they lost their place in memory. Children learned the names of carrots and potatoes and lettuce, but not skirret or orage or patient stock. And what is not named rarely feels real. So generation by generation, the absence became complete. Yet in archives and monasteries and handwritten notes from long ago, these vegetables remain casually mentioned as if they were obvious and unremarkable, which they were at the time. And this is perhaps the strangest part of the story, that what feels exotic now was once ordinary, and what feels ordinary now was once unfamiliar. This constant exchange between novelty and normality is how food history quietly moves. And when people say big agriculture banned these vegetables, it is often because it feels easier to imagine a single decisive moment rather than a long series of small choices. But history is rarely shaped by single moments. It is shaped by habits, and habits favor what is easy and repeatable. Medieval vegetables were neither of those things. They asked for patience, they rewarded familiarity, and they accepted variation. Modern systems prefer obedience and predictability, and so, without anger and intent, one replaced the other. And as you listen to this now, in a world where food appears endlessly available, it is worth remembering that abundance often comes at the cost of memory, and what we gain in convenience, we often lose in quiet complexity. And this loss does not demand attention or resistance because it happens slowly enough to feel natural. And if your mind is drifting as these words continue, that is fitting, because this history did not demand attention either. It simply unfolded while everyone was busy with something else.
And even now, the process has not truly ended, because agriculture continues to adjust itself to new pressures and new expectations. Crops are selected not only for yield, but for compatibility with machines and packaging, and consumer habits that change just enough each decade to require constant refinement. And each refinement narrows the field a little more. Medieval vegetables were comfortable existing in small numbers and irregular shapes, but modern systems require predictability across millions of units, and so plants that once thrived through diversity are filtered out through requirements they were never meant to meet. This filtering does not feel like exclusion because it is framed as optimization. Yet optimization always implies comparison, and comparison always implies elimination. And this is why so many old vegetables survive only at the edges of the system, grown by individuals who are not trying to feed cities, but simply curious about taste and history. These growers operate outside the expectations of scale and profit, and in doing so keep alive something that would otherwise slip entirely into text. Seed exchanges and small gardening groups quietly pass along varieties that have no commercial value, but plenty of historical presence. And this underground survival is perhaps the least dramatic form of resistance imaginable. There are no slogans or demands, only envelopes of seeds labeled in careful handwriting and planted without expectation. Medieval vegetables do not demand a comeback. They do not seek relevance. They are content to grow when given the chance. And that patience is what made them unsuitable for modern agriculture in the first place. Patience cannot be rushed and cannot be automated. And as long as food systems continue to move faster than seasons, these plants will remain out of step. Yet their continued existence, even in small spaces, suggests that disappearance is rarely total. History does not erase, it simply reduces visibility. And reduced visibility feels like absence, even when something remains. When people speak of banned vegetables, what they are often reacting to is this sense of invisibility,
The idea that something once common can vanish so completely from everyday experience without anyone noticing when it happened. And that discomfort lingers because it suggests that many other ordinary things could follow the same path, quietly edited out not by force but by preference. And this realization does not require alarm, it simply invites awareness, and awareness itself does not demand action. It only asks that we notice, and noticing in a world designed for speed is itself a slow act, perhaps the slowest of all. And if you find yourself listening without urgency, without expectation, then you are participating in the same slowness that once allowed these vegetables to exist without needing justification. And that is enough, because boring history has never needed an ending, it only needs time to pass. And time continues to pass, whether anyone is paying attention or not. Seasons still arrive in the same order, even if fewer people notice the difference between them. Fields still rest and recover, even when production schedules pretend they do not. And in this quiet continuity, the old vegetables remain possible. Not practical, perhaps, but possible, which is a small but important distinction. Possibility does not require demand. It only requires conditions: soil, light, water, and patience, the same simple requirements they always had. Medieval farmers did not think in terms of market share or consumer preference. They thought in terms of survival and familiarity. If a plant returned year after year and filled a pot, it was considered successful. Modern agriculture measures success differently, and that difference in measurement explains more than any idea of banning ever could. Nothing was outlawed, it was simply outperformed according to new rules. And rules once established feel natural even when they are recent. Uniform carrots feel normal now, even though they would have looked strange centuries ago. Lettuce, available in every season, feels expected, even though it once followed weather closely. This sense of normality makes it difficult to imagine alternatives, and when alternatives disappear, imagination often follows. Medieval vegetables are difficult to picture not because they were rare, but because they no longer appear in shared spaces like stores, menus, and advertisements. Visibility shapes memory, and memory shapes reality. So when something loses visibility, it slowly loses its claim to being real. This is how a vegetable becomes a curiosity, and then a footnote, and then a trivia question. Yet footnotes have a way of waiting patiently for readers who are willing to slow down enough to notice them. And history is full of such waiting, not for rediscovery necessarily, but for quiet acknowledgement. These vegetables do not ask to return to dominance. They do not compete. They simply exist where the pressure is low enough to allow them to do so. And perhaps that is the most boring and honest lesson in all of this, that disappearance is often not an event, but a condition, created when speed, scale, and sameness become priorities. And as long as those priorities remain, some things will always fall out of view, not because they lack value, but because their value cannot be measured quickly. And if this realization feels gentle rather than alarming, that is appropriate. Because nothing about this process was sudden or loud. It unfolded in the background while life moved on. And if your thoughts are drifting now and the words feel distant and unimportant, then this history is being experienced exactly as it was lived, quietly, partially noticed, and easy to forget, which is how most of the past continues to exist, not demanding attention, but accepting it only when it happens to arrive. And arrival does not need to be dramatic to be real. Sometimes it is simply the moment when attention settles long enough for something unremarkable to be seen again. And these vegetables exist in that space between memory and soil, neither fully gone nor fully present, waiting without expectation. Medieval agriculture did not rush them, and modern agriculture did not have time for them. And between those two approaches lies a long stretch of quiet absence, the kind that does not feel like loss until someone pauses long enough to notice the gap, And even then, the gap does not ask to be filled. It simply exists as evidence that choices were made. Not malicious choices, but practical ones, repeated often enough to become invisible. And invisibility is powerful because it feels neutral. No one argues with what they cannot see. And so the fields change, and the menus change, and eventually the language changes too. People stop asking where certain foods went because they no longer remember them being there. This is why the idea of a ban feels appealing. It gives shape to absence and assigns intention. But the truth is much slower and much less intentional. Systems moved forward, and these plants stayed where they were. And staying still in a moving world can look very much like disappearance. Yet stillness has its own kind of endurance. Seeds remain viable long after interest fades. Knowledge remains recorded long after use ends. And the possibility of return always exists, even if it is unlikely. And perhaps that is enough, not because everything needs to return, but because knowing that it could reminds us that the present is not the only way things have ever worked. And this awareness does not demand change, it only offers perspective. Perspective that arrives quietly and leaves no obligation behind. And as this narration continues without urgency, without conclusion, it mirrors the subject itself. A story with no climax and no resolution, only continuation. Because boring history does not conclude, it simply settles. And if you are listening without fully listening, if the words blur together and time feels unimportant, then this is not a failure of attention, it is participation. This is how history usually sounds when no one is trying to make it interesting. And in that uninteresting sound, there is something steady, something untroubled, something that does not ask to be remembered at all.
And untroubled is exactly how these medieval vegetables existed for centuries, neither demanding notice nor resisting it. They grew in small gardens and quiet fields, their leaves and roots following seasons without concern for calendars or markets. People harvested them as needed and allowed them to rest when the year dictated. And in that rhythm, they were reliable in ways modern crops often are not. Modern agriculture measures reliability by consistency and transportability and profit, whereas medieval vegetables measured it by endurance and adaptability in taste. And because modern systems prioritize the measurable, they gradually replace the patient with the predictable, and predictability feels natural when it is everywhere. And when a plant no longer fits the everywhere, it slowly vanishes from sight, not by law or decree, but by quiet neglect. Yet neglect is not the same as extinction. Seeds lie dormant in vaults and backyards and occasionally sprout when curiosity or care returns to them. And sprouting does not require approval. It only requires time and suitable conditions, time that most systems now are too busy to provide. And so these vegetables survive in hidden spaces, known only to those who slow down enough to notice. Their continued existence is subtle evidence that disappearance is rarely total, and that history is rarely complete. It is accumulated attention and neglect layered over long stretches, and awareness of this layered history allows us to perceive absence not as an accident, but as a pattern, a result of repeated choices that seemed minor at the time. And noticing patterns requires patience, which is the very quality these vegetables demanded and modern agriculture rarely provides. And in noticing without expectation or urgency, we participate in the same quiet history, observing without changing it, accepting without resisting. And if your mind drifts as you listen, that is appropriate, because the story itself moves at the pace of patience, not speed. And patience is enough to preserve memory, even when prominence is lost. And prominence is not permanent, it is only attention multiplied. And these vegetables exist in a state between being remembered and being forgotten, neither celebrated nor erased, simply waiting and enduring as history quietly continues around them. And enduring is the simplest form of resistance, for these vegetables do not protest their neglect nor demand recognition. They simply grow when conditions allow, quietly fulfilling the purposes they always had. And this quietness contrasts sharply with modern expectations of productivity and visibility,
because today crops are judged by their ability to meet schedules, withstand transport, and satisfy consumer expectations, whereas medieval vegetables were valued for their presence in gardens, their ability to return season after season, and the subtle differences each harvest could bring. And in this difference lies the reason they faded from widespread use, not through malice or active banning, but through the slow, cumulative effect of priorities that favored speed, uniformity, and predictability over patience, variation, and subtlety. And as the years passed, knowledge of how to cultivate and prepare these plants also declined, not abruptly but incrementally, each generation retaining only what was useful or convenient. And knowledge once lost contributes to absence, because even if seeds exist, if no one knows how to grow or use them, they remain dormant in every sense of the word. And this dormancy contributes to the sense that these vegetables are gone, even though they are only hidden, quietly waiting. And this waiting is a form of survival that does not require attention or applause. Survival in quiet corners of gardens and archives and seed banks, where they are preserved by patience and care rather than necessity. And in this quiet preservation lies a lesson that is entirely consistent with boring history, that disappearance is often the product of accumulation rather than a single event, of repeated small decisions rather than dramatic interventions. And if you continue listening without expectation, you are experiencing the same slow, cumulative process that determined the fate of these vegetables, a process that unfolded over centuries in silence. And that silence itself is the story, stretching from medieval fields through modern farms to wherever you are now, noticing it or not, as it quietly persists. And quietly persists it does, stretching across centuries and landscapes, because history is rarely sudden. It unfolds like the slow growth of a root vegetable buried in soil, unseen and unremarkable until someone digs or remembers. And these medieval vegetables lived for generations in that unremarkable space, fed by rain and sun, tended by hands that had learned the rhythm of seasons without the guidance of calendars or markets. And their value was not measured in profit, but in sustenance, familiarity, and continuity. And yet continuity is difficult to maintain in a world that prizes speed, uniformity, and efficiency. And so, as farms expanded and systems industrialized, the patient and varied forms of plants were gradually replaced with the predictable and repeatable, each small choice building upon the last until the landscape of vegetables was simplified. And simplification does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly until something once ordinary becomes curious and eventually unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity grows the sense that something has been lost, although no one ever took it away. And this loss is not sudden or dramatic. It is slow and unnoticeable, like water wearing away stone over centuries. And with the disappearance of these vegetables went more than taste. It went knowledge and ritual, subtle ways of preparing and consuming food that taught patience and observation. And without repetition, these practices fade, and the fading of practice reinforces the fading of memory. So by the time modern observers look back at medieval gardens, many of the vegetables appear exotic, odd, or extinct, even though they are neither extinct nor particularly rare in certain corners of the world. They survive in seed banks, heirloom gardens, and in the hands of those willing to slow down and pay attention. And noticing their existence now is itself a quiet act of history, an acknowledgement of endurance rather than triumph. For endurance does not demand recognition, it merely persists. And in persistence lies a form of continuity that is subtle and patient, unlike modern attention, which is fleeting and selective. And this difference is essential to understanding why big agriculture banned nothing, yet effectively made many plants disappear from mainstream consumption, because the rules of industrialized farming favor measurement, predictability, and scale, whereas medieval vegetables thrived in irregularity, subtlety, and care. And irregularity does not fit on a spreadsheet, subtlety does not calculate easily, and care requires time that systems do not account for. And so, without malice or drama, without law or decree, vegetables like skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzona, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, landcress, and salsify simply became uncommon, quietly edged out by priorities that valued output over tradition. And as they became less common, knowledge about them decreased, consumption decreased, and eventually their presence in memory faded almost entirely. Yet seeds remain, waiting quietly, ready to grow if someone slows down enough to notice them again. And this waiting stretches across time, an invisible thread linking past gardens to present ones, reminding us that disappearance is rarely absolute, and that history often persists in quiet endurance rather than dramatic events. And if you are still listening without urgency, without expectation, then you are experiencing the same slow, cumulative process that determined the fate of these vegetables, a process that unfolded over centuries in silence. And that silence itself is the story, stretching from medieval fields through modern farms to wherever you are now, noticing it or not, as it quietly persists.
And persistently, as all boring history does, it continues, stretching forward even as attention drifts, because time in history does not hurry, and the lives of these medieval vegetables were measured in seasons and patience rather than headlines or market trends. And as modern agriculture rose to prominence with its emphasis on speed, uniformity, and scale, it created a landscape in which only certain plants could thrive commercially, leaving others, equally capable in their own ways, relegated to gardens, seed banks, and the memory of careful farmers. And these vegetables, skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzonera, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, landcress, and salsify survived quietly where interest and patience remained, not because they were better or worse than their replacements, but because they were slower, subtler, less immediately measurable. And modern systems, designed to maximize output and predictability, gradually eliminated the need to grow or consume them at scale. And elimination through absence feels less like an event and more like a condition, a state created over decades as small decisions accumulated. Seeds that were once saved routinely were now replaced with commercially available varieties optimized for shipping and appearance. Knowledge that was once passed carefully from gardener to gardener became rarer with each generation, and familiarity faded, so that by the time these vegetables were noticed again, they seemed strange, exotic, or forgotten entirely. Yet they were never truly gone, only out of sight, waiting in soil, in seed packets, in quiet corners. And their endurance is a testament to patience, to the invisible continuity of things that do not demand attention. For endurance does not need applause, it simply continues, quietly, steadily, and persistently. And this quiet persistence contrasts with the loudness of modern history, which is measured in events, headlines, and rapid change, whereas the slow story of medieval vegetables reminds us that most history is unremarkable, gradual, and cumulative, shaped not by single moments of drama, but by long sequences of small, repeated choices. And noticing this as it unfolds now, without urgency, mirrors the rhythm of the vegetables themselves, unhurried, patient, and enduring. And if you continue to listen in this state, you are engaging with history as it usually exists, not as spectacle or story, but as quiet presence. And in that presence lies understanding that disappearance is rarely total, that absence can be partial and invisible, and that survival is often quiet, patient, and enduring beyond attention. And this quiet, patient endurance stretches forward indefinitely, just as the story of these forgotten vegetables continues to stretch across centuries, fields, and gardens, waiting, unnoticed, and entirely ordinary, yet still very much alive. And still very much alive, they persist,
quietly threading through time from medieval gardens to modern seed banks, from forgotten fields to small backyard plots, unnoticed by the bustling machinery of industrial agriculture, yet surviving because endurance requires no permission, no approval, and no attention. And as the centuries passed, the rules and priorities of farming shifted steadily toward efficiency, uniformity, and predictability. And each shift gently nudged these vegetables further from common use, not through decree, not through law, not through ban, but through accumulated preference for crops that could be counted, packed, shipped, and sold consistently across hundreds or thousands of miles. And the vegetables themselves did not resist this change. They remained as they had always been, patient, variable, subtly flavorful, requiring care and knowledge that fewer and fewer people retained. And as knowledge faded, consumption decreased, familiarity waned, and absence became the dominant condition, even though seeds and scattered patches still existed, quietly waiting in gardens, fields, and archives for someone willing to notice them. For history often survives in the unnoticed and unremarkable, quietly threading continuity through time. And each medieval vegetable, skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzonera, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, land cress, and saucify, and others less remembered, tell the same story, that survival is often about patience and persistence rather than visibility, that endurance does not require drama, and that absence does not equal extinction. And as modern agriculture continues to expand and evolve, it does so with the same principles that gradually sidelined these vegetables, privileging predictability over diversity, speed over patience, and scale over subtlety. And yet, even in this system, fragments remain, quietly reminding us that history is cumulative, slow, and ordinary, that the disappearance of something does not mean it has ceased to exist, only that attention has shifted. And noticing these remnants now, even in passing, is itself a form of engagement, a recognition that endurance persists in quiet corners, that the rhythm of slow growth, careful tending, and patient waiting is still ongoing. And if you continue to listen in this slow, unhurried way, drifting through time and thought, then you are engaging with this same quiet history that allowed these vegetables to endure, patiently, steadily, and without attention. For most history, like these vegetables, does not demand notice. It simply continues, quietly, persistently, and unnoticed, stretching from medieval gardens into the present, carrying lessons in patience, endurance, and the ordinary rhythms of life. And quietly surviving, they remain, weaving through centuries without fanfare, often overshadowed by the spectacular, the dramatic, and the immediately profitable. Yet their existence is steady and unbroken, much like the slow rhythm of seasons that once dictated all life in medieval gardens. And while modern agriculture demands speed, uniformity, and scale, these vegetables persist where patience and observation still hold value, growing in backyards, in experimental plots, in seed banks, and in the memories of those who remember their subtle flavors and irregular forms. And this persistence teaches a form of history that is slow, cumulative, and unremarkable, a history measured not in revolutions or headlines, but in repeated small choices, in seeds sown and saved, in knowledge passed from one careful gardener to another. And in this way, skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzonera, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, land cress, and saucify, and others less remembered, tell the same story, that survival is often about patience and persistence rather than visibility, that endurance does not require drama, and that absence does not equal extinction.
And as modern agriculture continues to expand and evolve, it does so with the same principles that gradually sidelined these vegetables, privileging predictability over diversity, speed over patience, and scale over subtlety. And yet, even in this system, fragments remain, quietly reminding us that history is cumulative, slow, and ordinary, that the disappearance of something does not mean it has ceased to exist, only that attention has shifted. And noticing these remnants now, even in passing, is itself a form of engagement, a recognition that endurance persists in quiet corners, that the rhythm of slow growth, careful tending, and patient waiting is still ongoing. And if you continue to listen in this slow, unhurried way, drifting through time and thought, then you are engaging with this same quiet history that allowed these vegetables to endure, patiently, steadily, and without attention. For most history, like these vegetables, does not demand notice. It simply continues, quietly, persistently, and unnoticed, stretching from medieval gardens into the present, carrying lessons in patience, endurance, and the ordinary rhythms of life.
And the ordinary rhythms of life continue to shape these vegetables even now, long after they ceased to be common in markets or widely recognized by people, because survival does not require attention, only suitable conditions. And these conditions, soil, water, light, and care, exist quietly in gardens, seed banks, and forgotten corners, allowing skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzonera, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, land cress, salsify, and other less remembered varieties to endure, their presence largely invisible to modern systems which prioritize speed, uniformity, and scale. Yet the endurance of these vegetables reminds us that disappearance is rarely total, that what seems gone often persists in subtle, unnoticed ways, and that history itself is rarely dramatic, but instead composed of countless small, unremarkable continuities, quietly shaping the present, even when it goes unnoticed. And as agriculture continues to advance, favoring the measurable over the subtle, the rapid over the slow, and the standardized over the varied, these vegetables continue to exist on the margins, in small gardens, seed banks, experimental plots, and in the hands of patient growers who remember them. And their endurance teaches a subtle lesson, that survival is not always measured by prominence, profit, or recognition, but by the ability to continue quietly across generations through shifting priorities, changing tastes, and evolving systems. And the list of forgotten vegetables, skirret, good King Henry, Alexander's, sea kale, rampion, perpetual spinach, garden orich, scorzonera, hedge mustard, patience dock, smallage, lovage, parsley root, land cress, salsify, and other less noted varieties illustrate how many ordinary things slip from common use without ever being truly lost, because seeds lie dormant, knowledge persists in small ways, and potential continues quietly, waiting for attention that may or may not come. And this quiet waiting is itself a form of resistance to the pressures of industrialized, efficiency-driven agriculture. And as centuries passed and diets became more standardized, these vegetables receded from everyday life, not because they were unwanted or forbidden, but because modern priorities favored predictability over diversity, rapid growth over slow adaptation, and commercial visibility over subtle presence. And yet they survived, preserved in ways that require no fanfare, reminding us that history is not always loud, spectacular, or eventful, that much of the past exists in quiet continuity, unnoticed by most, and that the ordinary persistence of these vegetables reflects a larger truth about the slow, cumulative, and enduring nature of history itself, which continues to unfold, patiently, steadily, and persistently, whether anyone notices or not. And if you are still listening, drifting along with these words, then you are participating in the same rhythm, the same ordinary endurance, the same quiet passage of time that has allowed these medieval vegetables to exist for centuries without attention, without recognition, and without urgency, simply persisting, steadily and unnoticed, as all boring history tends to do.